My name is Guilherme Canela. Currently, I'm the Chief of the Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists section here at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, but I dedicated my entire professional life to protect freedom of expression. Interesting enough, starting with the protection of the freedom of expression of children many years ago, which is a very interesting topic because the voices of children are not commonly authorized in many spaces. So protecting this kind of freedom of expression, but also dealing with the risks of the engagement, for instance, of children and teenagers with any kind of media is a very challenging discussion. First of all, of course, with any human rights, but particularly the civil and political rights, which is the case of freedom of expression, we need to be always very cautious on the way we try to actually protect these rights. Sometimes we do things that actually can jeopardize the protection of these rights instead of amplify them. So being concerned is part of the game and is necessary. The founding fathers and mothers of the universal system of human rights, when they were underlining freedom of expression, both in the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but later on in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, they were trying to add several safeguards to say, look, freedom of expression is very, very important for the entire agenda of human rights. Because if you don't have freedom of expression, you can't ask for the right of education. You can't ask for the right of dignity in labor. So Malala, she wants the right to education, but if she doesn't have freedom of expression in the first place, she can't ask for that. And Greta, for the environment, is the same. If her right to freedom of expression is not protected, she can't ask for a better environment or of dealing with climate change. So, in the first place, it's justified to be very careful because freedom of expression is a right that is quite relevant even to protect the other rights. However, we need to understand freedom of expression in its entirety. And sometimes when we are having these discussions, we only focus on the one part of freedom of expression, that is the right to speak, which of course is super important. But if we read carefully how freedom of expression is defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, those people there, the draft legislators of 75 years ago, people like Eleanor Roosevelt, they defined freedom of expression as the right to impart, which is to speak, but they use two other verbs, the right to seek and receive information, ideas, culture, entertainment. And let's pay attention, when we have a system flooded by disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, conspiracy theories, and so on and so forth, these two elements of the freedom of expression, the right to seek and receive, they are being jeopardized. Because how can you seek and receive if the entire system is flooded with things that actually forbid you to exercise your right to access to information, even your right to speak? Because when someone is attacking a female journalist like Maria Ressa or others, harassing them online, saying they know where their children study. And what they are doing is creating a situation where the right of these others to speak are also being jeopardized. So the point here is not to restrict freedom of expression, is to amplify freedom of expression, but considering how this right is understood in the international system in a comprehensive way. Is the right to speak, but also to seek and receive. So we need to have that very clear, and quite often this is not there. So there is a balance of the right to freedom of expression with other rights, which is true, and I will come back to that in a minute, but there is an internal balance in the right of freedom of expression itself. And we need to take that into consideration when we are doing these discussions. Now, that said, the founding mothers and fathers of this system also considered that there are some speeches that can put in risk the life and the protection of others, therefore other rights. So there is an article in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that is the Article 20, is speaking precisely about these kind of problems. And there are two elements there, propaganda for war and the speech, their hatred that actually leads to concrete violence. Those things are not authorized. The tricky issue is how we decide that. And then again, the international system of human rights have developed quite sophisticated tests that judges, regulators, and others, they need to use to decide if a legitimate restriction could be in place. Always remembering, these should be the exceptions. It should be the narrow little things that we need to be very careful. But there are tools in place. One is that we call the three-part test that judges could apply. And in the case of hate speech, that is so complex, the UN system, developed a test of 6 parts, not only 3, 6 parts. So it's difficult, yes, to deal with that. We should be concerned, yes. We should add safeguards, definitely. But it's possible to do that. It's not simple, but it's possible. The Article 19 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights says 3 things. First, any restrictions should be established in a law. This is very important because a law should be discussed, should be approved by a parliament. So it's not that anyone can just today say, I don't know, a minister or a policeman or a policewoman or a judge out of the blue say, well, this thing can be restricted. No, the first part of the test is this restriction established in a law approved by a parliament? Well, so first part of the test is okay. If it's not, the judge don't even continue the assessment. If the first part is failed, then you don't go to the, but okay, it's a law. Second part is legitimacy. And what is legitimacy? The international human rights law have established what are the conditions, what are the cases where freedom of expression can be limited. So this is legitimacy. It's not anything that the law can restrict, even if it is approved by a parliament. All the member states of the UN, they have signed these agreements, so they need to respect these agreements they have ratified. So a few things are authorized, they can be restricted, so this is the legitimacy. So the judge will say, is this in the law? Yes, check. Is this restriction that the law authorized legitimate? And legitimate means that it is in the provisions of the international human rights law. If it's yes, he or she will continue for the third part of the test. If not, they stop. No, it's in the law, but it's not legitimate, so I don't continue. The third part of the test is the most complex one, and also maybe the most important, is what we call necessity and proportionality. So sometimes the thing is in the law, it is legitimate, but the restriction of freedom of expression is not the most useful, necessary, or proportional way to solve the problem. So for instance, there are ways of solving problems that the best solution is to amplify freedom of expression instead of restricting freedom of expression. A good example is what we call the right to a reply. So maybe a journalist interviewed you or wrote about you, and there is a mistake about what that journalist wrote. So the judge, and you are not happy with that, and you go to a court, and you want this journalist to be in jail because he or she wrote something about you that is not correct. So the judge will look, well, in the law, is this in the law? If a journalist says something that is wrong and is defamatory about someone and so on, is this in the law? Yes, it is in the law. Is this legitimate? Yes, it's not the case of if it is defamatory, if it's causing problems for your professional life and so on. There is legitimacy in discussing that. But is proportional to send the journalist to jail to solve this thing? No, it's not. And then you have solutions like the so-called right to a reply. So what the judge will tell the journalist, so you need to give to this person the right to explain why he or she doesn't agree with your story. So you see, in this situation, we are combating a problem that maybe was generated by a mistake, voluntary or involuntary, But we are combating this problem, not restricting freedom of expression. We are combating this problem, amplifying freedom of expression, because the right to a reply is also the right to speak on about a particular thing. So our experience in UNESCO, we are now 10 years doing an initiative that's called the Judges Initiative, and we have already engaged 24,000 judges and prosecutors from 150 countries in this program. Talking to all these people, our experience is that the use of these three-part tests helps to solve the majority of the cases. I mean, really, when they are using it, say, okay, this is interesting and helps me as a judge to address this case. There are a very few number of cases that, of course, they are more complex and then they require other kinds of assessment. There is not an international definition of hate speech. The Article 20 of the International Covenant, it speaks about a speech, hatred that leads to a concrete violence and discrimination, etc. But there is not any specific definition in the UN system of what is hate speech, and there is a good reason for not having this definition. It's because what can be considered hate in a particular context, in a particular language, in a particular historical situation, maybe does not mean anything in another context, in another historical situation, in another language. So having an international definition of such complex concepts that are related to anthropological situations, cultural situations, contextual situations, is very dangerous, is very risky, because then these definitions, just the generic definitions, they can be misused. This idea of countering hate speech is so important, and rightly so. No, we see this being included in the international human rights system after the Second World War, because we noticed how hate speech was very connected in the way that this tragedy of the Holocaust happened, and so on. So those that were building the international human rights system after the war, they were quite concerned about that. But then, even after, during the 77 decades of application of the human rights system, we have, of course, other cases, massively speaking, like the Rwanda genocide, for instance, or more recently what happened in a particular situation in Myanmar, and etc., with a particular group. So people are concerned about that. In some point, I guess it was more or less 10 years ago, there was a big meeting in Rabat in Morocco with different groups, freedom of expression groups, other human rights groups, lawyers and civil society organizations, to precisely discuss that. So what we do with this, with this complex concept. So then it was approved, the so-called Rabat Plan of Action on this particular issue of the incitement to hatred. And this plan has established this test that is more complex than the three-part test. So we do the three-part test, but for hate speech cases, we go beyond that. And this test, for instance, invites the judge or others to consider other elements. For instance, contexts. So context is important. It's not the same thing to say this particular word here or in these other countries or in this other language or in this other historical context. The other issue is who is speaking. It's also very important. If you are a Twitter user with 2 people following you, if you say something very bad, the possibility that this will cause a disruption, an actual violence, is very, very limited. But if you have 50 million followers, this is a completely different story. So the second part of the test, or the second element that is considered, is this, is who is speaking. Then there is a third element that they should consider, the people taking decision, the judge and others, that is intentionality. It sometimes is clear that there is an intention to cause harm. Other parts is not like that. If you look after a football game, the people for pro this team and pro that team discussing in Twitter, it seems like hate speech what they are saying to each other, no? But it's not that they are actually meaning that people should be killed and should be, no? So again, we would recommend strongly that in these cases the way of avoiding a misuse of this legislation against this kind of legislation to against freedom of expression is precisely to use these tools. The three-part test, and in this case has this name connected with the city that it was discussed. It's called the Rabat threshold. That is these 6 points that they should take into consideration when assessing decisions regarding hate speech. First, there is a difficulty here because these concepts, disinformation and misinformation, they exist in the English language, but in other languages we don't have two words to separate this, no? So in other languages you need to further explain because, for instance, in Portuguese you use desinformação for everything. There is not another word. Or in Spanish, desinformación. In English it facilitates because we have two concepts, so we have two different words. But basically the difference here is related to the intentionality. Again, remember that the tests of Rabat, again, intentionality is very important. Misinformation is, probably there is not a single person in this planet that haven't already done that. And what is that? You receive something in your WhatsApp or in your Signal or in your Telegram or whatever is the thing you use, and you receive that from your uncle, from your mother or from your friend. You trust them and you just forwarded it. And they probably received from someone else. And they believed that that thing was true, but it was not. It was a mistake. It was wrong. But there was not their intention to create a lie. There was not their intention to impact in a particular situation using that information that is, we know it's wrong, but who is circulating is not aware that it's wrong. So this is, in a nutshell, the idea of misinformation, is when wrong information is circulated, but it's not circulated with an intention to cause harm or financial gains or political gains and so on. Disinformation is a much more complex scenario because it is when the producer of that disinformation, of that content, is intentionally seeking to use that to cause a harm. Either it is to influence the results of an election or to tell people to not be vaccinated because there is a wrong ideology, but he or she knows that the vaccines work, but they are producing this against that, or because they hate a particular group, or because they want to silence someone, so they create a disinformation about that person. So basically, the difference here is regarding intentionality. As we can imagine, disinformation quite often are more sophisticated mechanisms because the producers are investing resources in producing this kind of content. In many situations, very sophisticated resources. We have what now is called deepfakes, that in some cases is very, very difficult to actually differentiate that person it was not the person who actually spoke that. So sometimes the deepfakes use a real politician or a real celebrity, and they make this person produce a speech that he or she have never said. But you can't realize unless you are really an expert in identifying this kind of thing. So this is the difference here. And then, of course, it's important also to tell our viewers that sometimes they are more used with another term, that is the term fake news. but we don't recommend to use this term. We think it's important to educate everyone that this term is very charged with ideology, because many different leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, started using this fake news story to actually attack journalists, to actually attack human rights defenders, and saying, you see, all these journalists are fake news, etc. And this is not a technical term. So luckily enough, our data is showing that when we did with the University of South Carolina, very interesting research, trying to identify what's happening with these kind of terms in the web, in the internet, and the term fake news was prevalent in the beginning of these kind of discussions, and now is going down and down and down. And the correct terms, disinformation and misinformation, are going up and up and up. Of course, it could look like just semantics, but is also, I would say, showing a positive element that the different players discussing these issues are incorporating the complexity of this discussion, and they started saying, okay, let's have this discussion in a serious way and not in an ideological way. No? UNESCO decided to put in the public sphere a discussion saying we are conscious that the internet is the biggest revolution for freedom of expression since Gutenberg. What does that mean? That the opportunities for everyone in this planet to express themselves, they have increased dramatically with the internet. And this is a good thing. Because this actually helps to protect not only freedom of expression, helps to protect other rights. However, these opportunities, fantastic opportunities, they come with some risks, and in some situations with concrete harms. So in a nutshell, our challenge here, not as UNESCO, as global community, is how we keep enhancing the opportunities, how we mitigate the risks, and eventually how we prosecute the harms. This is what we need to do. But it's easy to say, it's not easy to do. So UNESCO decided, okay, the best way of trying to address this is to call for a global dialogue on that. A global dialogue that needs to involve researchers. So what is the evidence telling us? We need more research, but there is a lot already there. It's a global dialogue that needs to involve the tech companies, the internet companies, saying, look, guys, you have been doing this for now a few decades. What you know, what you think are the risks, what you think are your own limitations, what is feasible, what's not feasible. We need to engage the human rights groups, the civil society organizations, the freedom of expression organizations, but also the children's organizations, the women's organizations, the people with disabilities, the organizations say, okay, what is the issue here? What do you expect? And we need to engage the regulators, the different people, not only the telecom regulators or the media regulators, but even others. For instance, the electoral bodies, in some countries they are regulators as well. They are more and more dealing with these issues you asked me, disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, conspiracy theories during elections. So what they do to protect the right of each citizen to vote, having access to a plural set of information and not in a system completely flooded with these kind of problems. No? So again, the intention of UNESCO is, we know there is a problem. Our goal here is how we address this problem while keeping protecting and further promoting freedom of expression. And for doing that, we need to listen to the relevant stakeholders in this. So that's the process. UNESCO launched a first text for facilitating this conversation. So let's talk about this. This text is receiving lots of comments, which is good. Is that the intention? Improve this here. It's not clear there, and so on. And we will have in Paris, but also hybrid, so people in other parts of the world can participate, an actual dialogue about this problem with all these different players. When the UNESCO's Director General decided to do this process, to call for this dialogue, etc., she decided that this would be under the area of freedom of expression of UNESCO. So I guess this is the first clear message. It's not in another area. It's the specific mandate area of UNESCO which is coordinating and facilitating this dialogue is the freedom of expression area. Second element, the text is available, publicly available for comments. We will keep publishing new iterations, new drafts of this text to, again, in a transparent manner, tell all the relevant stakeholders, look, we heard you, but this is how we heard you during the conference. And maybe we heard you in a wrong way. So tell us if the way we are changing this document or updating this document is really what you wanted to say during this conference or when you sent this comment via the different platforms that we are offering for that. I'm super confident that we are absolutely committed that this process is inclusive. And I'm open, and we are open in UNESCO, if someone is still not fully comfortable with that, to even not only receive comments regarding the text, but also receiving comments regarding the process. Maybe there are other suggestions that we can implement to making this process even more inclusive, considering, obviously, all limitations that always exist in any kind of process. No? We have this very fancy word in the UN system we call stakeholder groups. So these stakeholder groups that concretely are within the structure of the state, which is government, but is also judiciary, parliaments, regulators. I mean, this is not a monolith. There are different bodies within this thing we call abstractly the state. So this is one stakeholder group. And they are contributing, they are sending comments, etc. Other stakeholder group relevant here is the private sector, the tech companies, but also other kinds of companies that are in this ecosystem that is private. They are also sending comments, participating in the conversations, and so on. Then we have the civil society that is also not a monolith. We have freedom of expression organization, but we also have other groups, organizations, women, children, people with disability, other minorities, and so on. They are also sending comments to us. Then we have the more academic university think tank groups that are producing research. They also are sending comments. And then we have in this area what we call technical community, the engineers, the computer scientists behind the architecture of the internet. They are also sending comments. So in terms of the diversity of the comments and the groups participating and from different parts of the world, they are there. From those different groups, they produced very detailed comments. And to give you a number, in these very detailed comments, aggregating all of them, they were more than 1,000 comments to the document. So and we are not complaining. It's what we were expecting, to actually have enough inputs to make this better. So this is our main goal here, is to improve the quality of this, recognizing it's a very complex issue. Then the other important element, I guess, to quantify and to make sure that we are really promoting a global dialogue is the interest in the conference itself. So as we speak, we have almost 3,000 people registered for the conference from all over the world, all different stakeholder groups. And of those, 1,500 are signaling to us they will be physically here in Paris for this discussion. And for us, this is a good sign. I mean, it's a sign that this issue is one of the most crucial issues of our times. It really triggers the interests of the different groups. It's absolutely fair that they don't agree on how to move this forward, hence having a global dialogue about that. But as I said from the outset, it's very clear in the way that this is framed for us. We are trying to coordinate and facilitate this discussion, but with a clear boundary, that is how we do that while protecting and promoting freedom of expression and other human rights. This is our basic principle here. All other things we are open to listen, to accommodate, to discuss, but those two are non-negotiables in this conversation. We need to do that while protecting freedom of expression and other human rights. Democracies, or the democratic space, or the democratic horizon or endeavor, it's not about finding consensus. It's actually about respecting the disagreements. Democracies is about having lots of different views, sometimes conflicting views. But so how we protect these several dissensus, or how we accommodate that without violence. And this is a huge challenge. We will need to, this violence sometimes is a violence that is concrete physical violence, sometimes is a verbal violence, but that has strong consequences, mental health issues, etc., or chilling effects. Some people gave up to speak because they feel threatened. And in the case of young people, we are talking about bullying, cyberbullying. All this has very, very dramatic consequences, or might have dramatic consequences. So I would invite everyone to actually think about that. You don't need to agree with the others. That's not the point. But we need to find a way to get back to a civilizatory process in the public sphere. And this civilizatory process is how we disagree without being violent. In terms of the citizens overall, put yourself on the shoes of the other. I mean, would you like to receive a response like that? That doesn't mean that you need to agree. You can strongly disagree. And so this is, at the end of the day, is part of education. It's what in UNESCO we call media and information literacy, is how you interact with this digital ecosystem, understanding how we do that living in society, living with others, and so on. But of course, education takes time. It's not a solution for the short term. So while this is going on, while there is media and information literacy, while education is taking place and trying to raise this issue of how people can respect the rights of others, of course, it's necessary to think on other policies that can reduce the eventual damages that this situation can cause for individuals, for democracy, and so on and so forth. Here, maybe the big question again is about a collective thinking on how we do this kind of stories, no? And how this, at the end of the day, if we are successful, and I'm not only talking about UNESCO, about this collectively in producing some sort of policy, some sort of guidelines for that, how this is going to be useful for everyone else. And I think this is an important part because some of these concerns or this criticism, they are thinking of this process only empowering a particular player, for instance, empowering the regulators or the UN or the governments. But at the end of the day, if people read carefully this document or they participate carefully in this process, they will realize the following. It's indeed telling the regulators what can be done in a different way to address this problem, with lots of safeguards, saying, look, it's not anything that is accepted here. Almost like the three-part test. This thing should be in law. This thing should be legitimate. This thing should be necessary and proportional, which means lots of different characteristics for doing this regulation in line with international human rights law. So, but it is serving to the regulators. Well, this is also good for the companies because at the end of the day, having 194 different laws that does not talk to each other in a thing that is global, that is internet, is not good either. And even for the companies dealing with 194 different systems that are not aligned by a basic principle that is human rights, it's very, very bad. So for the companies, this also should be seen as a great opportunity to say, okay, here there is something that we can dialogue with because there is a common principle, and the common principle is this one, is human rights. And for the companies will be also a protective tool to say to a particular legislator saying, well, what you are suggesting is not aligned with this. So we are not against regulation, but we are in favor of a regulation within certain boundaries. And those are the boundaries, the human rights boundaries. And for the people, the civil society, the citizens, is equivalent. They will have some guidelines to hold both governments and the companies accountable. They can then with this and say to the, but you parliament of country X, what you are proposing is not what is in these guidelines. You don't have an independent regulator. You don't have these safeguards here. Or they can come to the companies and say, well, you are saying you like regulation for human rights, but you are not doing this and this and this. So we really need to look into this in a holistic manner in terms of results if we do this well. It's not only for the government, it's not only for the companies, it's not only for the society. If this is well done, these guidelines, they can be actually a tool in different angles that will be useful for all the different players in this process. And at the end of the day, this is what democracy is about, is that with all the different legitimate interests, civil society has legitimate interests, company has legitimate interests, government has legitimate interests, and sometimes they are not the same. So how we make sure that all those different interests, they converge for one unique common goal, that is the protection and promotion of human rights of everyone.